We're delighted to have all of you here in person, folks online as well. We're looking forward very much to 3 days of really exciting and enriching conversations. The theme for this year, as you know, is urban transitions. So we'll open with our director, Aromar Ravi, just kicking us off. So over to you, Aro.
We're very glad to have you here, and I think we'll have the room filling up. Plus, we have a lot of people online. This is an important theme for us, and I think for the world at large, because there is a significant debate and contest on how transition should work itself out. The overarching hegemonic transition, which is sometimes contested just now, is around two or three themes. One theme, of course, is economic transition. Fine. So at least the rhetoric is that it's going to grow, and as everybody grows, the quality of life, dealing with questions of poverty, etc., will go away. It's not so simple as that. And I mean, in India especially, there is this strong and important discourse which is centered around an idea of GDP growth, which is kind of a useful thing, but it has its limitations around a range of questions. But this idea that we will double and triple and reach certain targets in terms of becoming a developed country or not, and that development is kind of focused on sort of economic development, and especially a numeraire that includes stuff that comes from the national accounts. That's one kind of a transition. So you're going from underdeveloped to developed, etc. There's a big issue as far as India is concerned, and I would say many parts of Africa and to some extent Latin America, and that is the conventional development model doesn't work for us. And it doesn't work because if you look at India's economic transition or the processes that are on at the moment, we're not following the conventional model, which to some extent, China has partially done. So China has gone from an agrarian culture to one that's focused on manufacturing. It's trying to make the transition out into a whole range of other things just now, and it may or may not happen. It's almost impossible for us to follow that path. Firstly, because the services sector has become and has been historically now for the last 50 years or so one of the most important sectors in terms of economic activity in India. And the services sector in India is unlike what it is in North America or Europe. It has always been the residual, not for now, for the last 200 years or so, because a large number of people who didn't own land for a long period of time, especially most disadvantaged people, have never been really part of either the agrarian sector because they didn't own land, were not part of manufacturing. We went through a period in the 18th and the 19th century, early 20th century of deindustrialization in some senses. So where do you find them? You find them in the residual in the services sector. So we have a very, very strong services sector. It's quite large, but it's also highly differentiated, and there's a deep inequality between one element and the other. So in that sense, as far as this part of the world is concerned, this transition on the economic front, which uses the standard model, has not worked and will not work. In fact, one of the big debates, and it's not a new one, it's a very old debate for about 60 or 70 years in development economics, is what are the other pathways in this transition, economic. So that's I guess one of the core framing questions that are there, and that is, first of all, does economics add up to everything that we're interested in and useful? The second thing, of course, which is I think a pretty important thing, is sitting behind this, and those of you who work on human development understand this quite well. Sitting behind this really is, where do you invest in? Do you invest in infrastructure and things that create economic growth, or do you invest in people? And this has been a debate again in many parts of the world. In India also, there are many parts of the country which have different models of development. The classic story has been Kerala versus Gujarat. Tamil Nadu is a little bit different in some senses. So I guess the other question, let's say, in terms of transition is, how do you deal with transitions around education and health? Because education, health, and social protection in some senses are the core element of what we look at in terms of, at least from state delivery of services, in terms of human development. So even there, we're seeing significant shifts, and those shifts are not only national, but they're global. So at the current point of time, if you look at the global frame that's there, the number of people who come out of institutions of higher education in the global south has, for the last few years, exceeded that of people who are coming out from the global north. Part of this is demographic, fine, because if you add India and China together, you have almost 2.8 billion people. If you add South Asia, India, and China together, you have 3 billion people out of 8. So part of that is demographic, but part of that, of course, is the question, of how we've enabled both in terms of health, and there are many issues with health in many parts of the world, including in this part of the world. But if you look at the gross outcomes that are there, we've certainly over the last 60 done a lot in terms of increasing life expectancy. The quality of life is maybe not as good as it should be, but in terms of significant outcomes, that's a big achievement, fine? So there has been a health transition, but the health transition has got, I would say, a forked sort of element to it. We were focused for a long period of time on infectious diseases, fine? So infectious diseases are still very real. In fact, many things are coming back in that space that were not there earlier. If many of you, and we have a panel here on water and sanitation, one of the biggest achievements of public health was dealing with certain kinds of waterborne diseases. So we've done pretty well in that space, but we're going backwards in some senses, because there are limitations of what you can do without deep systemic change along the entire cycle as far as it's concerned. Plus, a whole range of other challenges that come from the kind of food we eat. So we've had the Green Revolution, which has done a tremendous amount of things in terms of food security, but it has now significant impacts on the health side because of how nutrition is structured. So you may in some senses, have enough food in a particular environment or a country, but that doesn't mean that undernutrition is not an issue, because undernutrition or malnutrition is not only lack of access to calories and a whole range of micronutrients. It can also be at the other end, where people are seriously obese. And in India, we know that we're at the we're in the throes of a very, very serious epidemic that's around cardiovascular disease in some senses, and also questions of diabetes, which are driven by lifestyle, but also by diet. Fine. So there is a health transition that's going on. It's a complex transition that, in some senses, many colleagues in the room and many of you actually look at these questions. In previous versions of Urban Arc, we've looked extensively at this. So you have informal settlements in which you have both the ID, the infectious disease transition, and the NCD transition happening simultaneously. So you find a whole range of things that you would not expect to see. You find people on dialysis in informal settlements. You have people who have serious diabetes, and our health systems are not adequate to deal with that. So this is a very, very serious challenge for us. And in some senses, the reason why it's a systemic challenge is because the stresses or the risks actually come from our form of development. Fine. So many of the solutions you use to deal with some things are actually the causes of new sets of emergent problems as far as it's concerned. This similar thing in our education systems. India, for certain, and many other parts of the world, did not invest early enough in elementary education. I mean, we passed our act, which made elementary education, in a sense, a universal right in some ways, 55 years almost into the post-independence period, which is kind of a little bit crazy, but that has had a huge impact on the nature of our societies in terms of access, the quality of employment and livelihoods, because we didn't invest enough. But because there's such a large number of people, you do find whatever 10, 15, almost 20 million people coming into the workforce each year. So there's a contradiction apparent contradiction in some senses, in which the education transition, which is now we have the new education policy, which also brings in early childhood education, which should happen a long time back. So you have early childhood, then you have elementary processes, you have a new breakdown of what happens as people go into higher education. That whole process is also pretty important, because if you want to maintain and manage a knowledge economy, or bring the value of what we've done in the services sector back into manufacturing, agriculture, you have to have people who are educated and are able to critically engage with these questions. So these are happening simultaneously. The educational transition, in some senses, there are big issues with it, as many of us know. We are all researchers in the space. We are products of that system. Many parts of that system are actually broken. It's not balanced. We had a much more balanced system at some point of time, but because we've grown, there have been a whole range of questions of regulation and privatization, et cetera, et cetera. So in some senses, we're not doing young people in this country a great favor with what we have. We have serious challenges in that system. And in some senses, many of us are trying to sort of correct for that. So if you look at those two things, and then you have the challenge of dealing with social protection. So I guess the good thing in India is, over the last many years, we've seen a lot of very interesting, innovative experiments in this space. Historically, there's been an orientation to dealing with questions of social protection, and many of my colleagues are leading figures in this space, and as an institution, we've done a lot in this thing. The question is, how does it tie up with a whole range of other processes? And this is a question that not only we're dealing with in South Asia, and This is in Bangladesh and certainly in Pakistan, etc. There are similar challenges. China has also struggled with this question over the last 20 or 30 years. The big debate among development economists in China, I still remember that from the early 2000s, was should we invest in infrastructure or should we invest in setting up a social protection frame? And of course, these things are set up as dichotomies, which they shouldn't be. You have to actually have a mix of different things as far as it's concerned. But the outcome of that, at least a partial outcome of that debate, was China decided to focus on infrastructure before it became old. This is very important because as you become an older population, the working population actually sometimes shrinks. And if productivity growth doesn't happen significantly enough, then you have a challenge of how to finance these systems. And that's exactly the challenge they're facing just now, because the social protection systems, which were very, very strong in the pre-reform, the pre-Deng area in China. So everybody had, entitlement to what they call the Einreichsbowl. So food, education, health, etc., was something that the state provided, maybe not of very good quality, but they provided universally to everybody. That system changed, and of course, they had a very particular way of looking at this thing because they had the system of the hukou, where you couldn't move from rural to urban areas. In this country, at least, and most of South Asia, that constraint is not there. That actually changed the entire system, the hukou and the one-child sort of policy, which has now been upended. So what I'm saying here is this is not a new question. It's an old question which actually plays itself out in different contexts. And even in a large subcontinental kind of country like India, you find differential responses to these kind of questions in different parts of the country. So, the relationship of what happened in Punjab versus Tamil Nadu, or what happened in Assam versus Maharashtra around these questions is somewhat different because it depends on the politics of the location. It depends on the questions of vulnerability. And very critically at this current point of time, as we're becoming a much more mobile culture in South Asia, on who migrates where and who has opportunities to move. Fine. In other parts of the world, especially Russia and China, etc., there have been physical constraints on whether you can move. In this country, thankfully, in the way that the constitution was framed, it gives you the ability to move from one location to the other. So, in a sense, historically, migration has been a very important, innovative response, in a sense, to challenges, economic, social, environmental, in various ways. People go out. Of course, there are significant losses that happen because sometimes you find your most entrepreneurial people moving out from a location and moving to another location. So, in a sense, the history of urbanization has been always rather confounded because of, and we have some of the key migration scholars in this country, I guess, in this room over the next 2 or 3 days. So in the process of looking where people are and how they're working, we have to think of it in at least these three sort of domains: education, health, social protection, and then where people are going to sit and how they're going to function. So while the economic structure question is an important question, and how that transition is going to work itself out depends on context and what choices you make, I think one of the core things that we're trying to explore here is in a highly unequal world. And that's the interesting point about this moment at the current point of time, because they are punctuated crises that we've seen over the last 120 or 30 years, where different forms of governance, different forms of sort of social and economic organization have come to into a situation where there's a sudden and a significant transition. I mean, the most important one, or well, the two most important ones in the last 50 years of history was in the First World War, where you saw the end of monarchies across much of the colonial past. Big transition that took place there. Of course, that had started 150 years before that with the French Revolution, with what happened in the United States and a whole range of other things as far as that's concerned. But that was one transition which had many elements of it. It had social elements of it, had economic elements to it, and much of it was driven by the increase of inequality that actually happened between the colonial powers and other sets of people. Of course, the colonized, so to speak, didn't have too much of a say, excepting for sending troops and getting them killed in a sense in the First World War. But that complete shift of structure and process of governance and how societies are organized was very significant that took place in that. So we are seeing something that may be similar in some ways. We're still trying to get our heads around it at the current point of time. Of course, there was another big transition that happened during the Second World War and after that, where large-scale decolonization happened. You now have a world that notionally has a whole range of countries, and within countries a lot more freedom to do a whole range of things. You have the United Nations that are trying to manage processes, etc. So you see over the sweep of history, and you're seeing just now a transition from core peripheral relationships. You can characterize it in various places, different frames of governance. And I think that's another trend that's so at one end you have globalization on the economic side, on the question of technology, but globalization has been very unequal. So some things are easy to move. Capital has historically moved for the last, in every stage of every sort of cycle of globalization, there are different forms of how that works. But capital has been highly mobile now for at least 150 years. And where capital sits and how it works has its own logic. And of course, you have many theoretical ways of understanding that, but that has tremendous mobility. Technology increasingly, as many of you, if you can reach into your pockets and look at your phones, and you can see that technology also has significant mobility, but that's also driven by high degrees of inequality. In fact, if you look at the largest corporations in the world, and if you take the top 10 or the top 20, their gross output is more than a large number of countries. So if you take trillion-dollar companies that didn't exist before, most of that is based on two or three things. One is access to capital and how that works itself out. The second thing is monopoly on technology. And the third thing is an IPR regime that basically excludes people from value as far as it's concerned. So, this process of how technological change is actually working stuff has very, very strongly sort of uh, catalyzed these significant shifts that are there. So it's a mix of all of these things happening at the same time. And I think at the current point of time, there's one more element that we often, at least in the 20th century, didn't look very, very serious as as a constraint, and that is questions of what well, you can call it biodiversity, you can call it climate, you can call it whatever it is, but it's basically challenges of the natural environment. Because we've gone from a globe, and if you look at India itself, 100 odd years ago, India had a population of less than 150 million. The world had about 1.5 billion people inside it. We're at 8 at the moment. As far as the world is concerned, we're going to go to 10. Very quickly, we might even exceed that, depending on how the demographics are going to play themselves out in the next, 15, 20 years or so. And India itself went from 1.5 to about 300 million, 150 million to 300 million in independence, and now we're at 1.4 billion because of a whole range of dynamics as far as it's concerned. The obvious impact of that, which is kind of very simple, and I won't get into the so-called population question here because there are a whole range of issues tied to gender and education and entitlement, etc. in that. The core question, of course, is irrespective of what you have, even if you have a large number of relatively poor people, if you have a large population, resource consumption is going to be very significant. So the impact from the local to the global in terms of consumption has been very significant. And the most obvious thing is, and we've known this for a long time, since the mid 80s, we have been within quotes at a global scale, and for many countries in the world, I mean, I can do this with lots of evidence, we have been in a situation of ecological deficit. So the net primary productivity, whatever that can come from natural systems, in some senses, is exhausted by the middle of the year. So we are anywhere between 50%, depending on where you are, to 150% in terms of deficit as far as it's concerned. And that obviously will have an impact. It has an impact in many obvious things, from land use changes. So, you have a large number of people, so you then bring a lot of area into agriculture. You destroy the soils because you have to increase productivity, because you bring in, commercial fertilizers and commercial pesticides, which of course is a very useful thing. India, in some senses, avoided a very, very serious challenge in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s in terms of food security, but that system is clearly unsustainable. So the idea of sustainability, in some senses, even though it has come to us from many, many directions, but certainly from the environmental movements and the crises that are there, has become a much wider omnibus of bringing things together. So, when many of us were involved between 2013 and 16, 15, 16, in negotiating the SDGs, the SDGs then became a process of building a political consensus to deal not only with environmental questions, and this is a very important thing to understand that's there. It is a recognition that the development frame that we work with, the development frame that in a sense dominates the world, how countries are managed, what people's aspirations are, etc., how consumption and production takes place. There's something desperately wrong with the development frame. This is not a new idea, it's an old idea. There have been critiques that have been going on from the 30s onwards, or even earlier around that. But there was a global recognition that the development frame was not working. And why was that so? There was a very serious crisis that happened in 2008. 2008 crisis was not in the global south, right? There were earlier economic crises that happened in the global south. The crisis started in the United States with the collapse of a whole range of economic institutions in what was considered to be one of the most advanced markets in the world. And that contagion spread all across the world, including in Europe. And you found the IMF, which normally has, played a very critical role in doing somewhat sort of extreme things in Latin America, Africa, and even in Asia, now sitting in the heart of Europe and dealing with questions that there was obviously, this is not, it was beyond a crisis of capitalism in, whatever. There was a whole discourse there about saving capitalism from the capitalists, etc. It was more than that because of at least two or three things. First thing is the acceptance or the understanding that rising inequality was creating a huge problem. And inequality between 2008 and now has grown even more dramatically. Fine? Economic inequality and various other forms in some senses. The second sort of recognition was that the governance systems that were set up at the end of the Second World War, economic governance, political governance, etc., were actually not working. They were not working for large numbers of people. There was a hope, let's say, in the Arab world and in many other parts of the world that you would have, a different regime, and in some senses, democratic processes would become deeper and more decentralized. And effectively, to deal with all of these challenges, you'd have a much more decentralized system of dealing with this kind of process. Fine? That didn't happen. So, in a sense, the panic, I would say, because I've seen this almost firsthand, within the governing institutions, within significantly the industrial countries, but also in large firms and financial institutions, was we need to try and bring everybody together. Now, this is a very different time. We're talking about 7 or 8 years ago. So we were able to forge a consensus which agreed on some things that seemed pretty obvious. But I would categorize them in 3 or 4 categories of things. So, it was a framework that has many limitations. It's too complicated and whatever it is. But the fact is, it's the best framework that we have at the moment. And what did the framework agree on? It said basically that everybody in the world, at least all the countries, the governments, the heads of state agreed that there will be some things that we do for everybody, right? So you would end hunger. This is not a new idea. This is an idea that goes back a long period of time, but it has been institutionalized in the development and the economic discourse now for 150 years. You would deal with poverty, which was possible because the Chinese actually had shown us a way that it was possible. So if you ask this question of people in the early 1990s, it was an aspiration that seemed possible. But China, because of its rapid transition over the 90s and the 2000s, actually had effectively ended it for them and in some ways enabled the world to meet its MDGs. Of course, it did it at significant cost to its population, etc. Maybe as not as badly as some of the earlier experiments that China has done. China has been very radical in its experimentation, from the Great Leap Forward to the Cultural Revolution, etc. They've done some pretty, difficult things and at some cost to their people. So the second thing was to end poverty. And in some senses, this has been a groundswell that has, been across the world since the process of extensive decolonization. Nobody at the moment wants to be a poor country. Nobody wants to be poor, so to speak. But poverty has many dimensions, and you cannot only measure it in terms of GDP per capita and stuff like that. It's an easy way of doing it. It's I would say a lazy way of doing this kind of thing, because poverty is related to a whole range of other things. There's social, economic dimensions, a whole range of other things that are tied to that. So that was the second thing that was obvious, fine. So, end poverty, deal with questions of hunger, make sure that universal access to education, healthcare, basic services are in place, fine. These are ideas that came to us from the 19th century, were tremendously fought by a whole range of forces, including the labor movements, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, plus other accepted ideas that came to us from the middle of the 20th century, fine, which was all basic services. So if you know the SDGs, it's that whole set of things about it. Health, education, water, sanitation. Energy became an important thing, fine. And energy became an important thing because if you don't actually have access to energy, livelihoods are very difficult to transform. And that's true of this country, where still we have a few 100 million people who do not have access to adequate energy. Forget about clean energy, adequate energy. And that's a real challenge, because that constrains a whole range of things on economic development, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a cluster of things that came to us from the 19th and the 20th century. And then there were a set of things that we're still struggling with just now, fine, I would say, in 2 dimensions. One dimension is the environmental dimension, which you're quite aware of, right? So questions of biodiversity, questions of how do you deal with other species, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the big thing which has now become very famous and popular in some senses, which is called the climate crisis, which in a sense brings together many of those elements that are there. So there's a whole debate around that question, which was unsettled. It was unsettled, and you can see that very clearly, because if you look at the SDGs in 2015, there was something that's called Goal 13, which is about climate, which was extremely weak, because nobody believed at that point of time that we would have a Paris Agreement in 2016. Because it's a very contentious thing. I'll come back to that in a second. So there's a cluster of environmental transitions that are there that need to be sorted out, and we'll come to justice inside that in a second. And the second thing, which is still very deeply, it was contested, it's still a big issue at the current point of time, is dealing with inequality. and not inequality in an abstract sense, but structural inequality in two dimensions. Yeah, the most obvious thing, and in a sense, the SDGs negotiations almost failed around that, was on questions of gender. Fine. Caste, of course, is something nobody can talk about in the UN because India refuses to let people talk about it. But anyway, that's the way it is. But there is a dimension around social inequality, which is very critical, which ties in a whole range of things. You can construct it in whichever way you want to, but it's centrally about gender, caste, ethnicity, and a whole range of questions about that. Still contested, and in some senses, the contest was some countries and some cultures saying, "Look, you are trying to impose our values on us." And much of that is around gender-related questions, and gender is not only about men and women; it's a whole range of things that are bundled together. And the second thing was deep economic inequality, which we've seen, like we've said, especially through COVID, rapidly increase across the world because of the way the economic system is currently structured, because financialization has become the primary driver of the process, and effectively the returns on investment, and this is Piketty's work and a whole range of other people, on the financial sector are much, much higher than what you find in every other sector. And if you look at that, four sets of capital, natural capital is typically delivering a negative return on investment because you're destroying it at the same time, and everything you're doing is trying to make sure that we're trying to extract as much as possible. So much of the primary sector, in some senses, is in deep deficit, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to deal with. So that's one core thing that's there. And then, of course, if you look at human beings also, human capital itself is meant to be a low return area. There's a big debate on this in the literature, where some people are saying actually this is one of the most, the areas in which actually delivers the highest returns, so to speak, depending on how you value and what you value. Much more than the productivity linked processes that are dependent on industrial investment. That was the whole idea that's there. And of course, the financial sector, because everybody wants to be rich, and the people who get rich are people who actually have control over money and investment and stuff like that, with the other people who don't. You have this sort of pairing off and this separation between all of these three or four worlds. So if your economy, your livelihood, your culture, your society is dependent on natural capital, you can be certain, if you're an indigenous person in some place, or a small farmer or a marginal farmer, or worse, a landless worker in some places, you're going to go down the stream, because the social or the economic consensus is that this is really not important, and we are all living with this stuff because inequality is something that drives the system and is implicit in what we do. So this is something that is actually still contested, not very well understood. And I think one of the core questions that we're trying to understand in these next few days is how this transition can be thought about, of dealing with inequality. It's sitting behind everything else we're talking about. It has been normalized at a gargantuan scale at the moment. Because if you look at all the big trillionaires of the world, they actually hold more output and more wealth than half the world's population. So how has this become normalized is an interesting question. How it can be undone is an even more interesting question in some senses. What are the ways that it can happen? What are the examples that it can happen, that can work? What are the theories and the ways of thinking about it? And of course, the practice of making that happen. So what I'm saying is, we're going through this process in which these transitions are happening very quickly in some senses. We don't necessarily look at them all the time because we're working in our own sectors that are there. But they are, and they sit at the heart of the so-called polycrisis that we see at the current point of time. So, the polycrisis in some senses may not be as critical as what happened in the 1940s or the 1910s or even later, because conflict has not left us. Conflict is still sitting pretty much across the world. It's just changed forms and et cetera, et cetera. The question is, these transitions are interesting, fine, but some of the dynamics actually haven't changed. They've actually being exacerbated. Plus, because we're a world in which there are lots of people, and the people are increasingly connected. One thing that starts off in one location can sort of contaminate, or like we saw in COVID, you have something that starts in Wuhan's not a very small city, but a relatively small city somewhere else. And in a period of weeks, not years, like the flu of, after the First World War, you find the entire world contaminated, you find the entire world system, in a sense, shut down in many ways, right? So the possibility of that exists, and that is because we're in a network world in some senses, and we have a whole range of things where connectivity gives us tremendous opportunities. Yesterday we had the PhD workshop, and I was telling people inside the workshop, some of them are here. I said, look, the challenge you folks have is when you get out of finishing your PhDs, your problem is of having too many choices. You have maybe 100 choices compared to people 20 years before you, and 20 years before that they had maybe one or two choices of where they would go and what they would do. So we have tremendous choices. We have a lot of opportunities, but those choices are often locked into a system which we don't always see and understand. So if that system has to change or it has to transform, the question is what will enable that to happen? And I think over the next few days, we're going to explore that in different ways. We'll start with the biophysical system in some senses, and we'll go on to deal with other elements of it. But one thing that ties this whole story together, which I would say is a megatrend of the 21st century, certainly, is the process of urbanization. And the process of urbanization is not of people moving from small places to bigger places. That's one element of it. Fine. It is fundamentally a cultural transition. Yeah, it is a deep cultural transition, and that's why you see, both in terms of tropes and politics and culture and even consumption. Weddings are a wonderful way of trying to track this in different parts of the world, uh, of shift from agrarian, patriarchal, often rural-based or sometimes forest-based cultures into something that's different. The interesting thing, of course, is in a planetary context, you can't say that we have an imagination of this that's 5,000 years old that worked. We actually have no idea of how to actually manage that process and where we need to go. So it's not only a question of transition that's going from here to there, and the starting points are different, so you have different transitions. It's also a question of imaginations, and I think that's the really challenging thing that we have very often as academics and practitioners. That is, if you have a clear idea where you want to go to, then a lot of people will engineer the way from here to there, whether it's social engineering or physical engineering or even ecological engineering in some senses. But a lot of the challenge we have today is dealing with the normative frames that we deal with, the values that we have, and our imaginations of what futures can look like. What are the core values that actually sit behind that? Because every political settlement has at the heart of it a set of core economic, political, and social values that are there. So if social stratification is an accepted form of engagement, whether it's gender inequality or caste inequality in some senses, and you want to carry that into the 2050s, you're going to have a very different sort of endpoint or sets of things that are happening there than if you say this is not acceptable. Fine. So those struggles absolutely on and they're happening all the time. But I think this question of transitions really has to be also linked the idea of imaginations and what forms of imagination and what spaces those imaginations can actually take. And of course, in that, there will be utopian ideas. And utopian ideas are useful not only because they may fail, but because they set counterpoints for which we can measure what we think is, in terms of a good life or whatever, all the kinds of things that are important to us. So what I'm going to encourage you folks to do is not only deal with questions of transitions, fine, moving from here to there and looking at those processes, but also questions of transformation. And you cannot look at questions of transformation without looking at two things. One is systemic change. Transformations do not happen by tinkering around at the corner. It doesn't work. And a lot of economics, a lot of our stuff in politics is about tinkering around what we have at the moment. The system is fundamentally flawed. It has many challenges, many pathologies. You cannot fix those pathologies without actually going in and redoing the architecture and the goals and the frameworks in which you work. But that's a hard job, and it often has serious economic, social, and political consequences, which most of us are not very happy with, right? Many of us are not very happy with. But you also cannot have transformation without actually having multiple, at least in my people may have different views of this, imaginations of what the future would actually be like. And those are underpinned by a set of values which you need to be able to share and call out. And sometimes that's difficult to do as a collective. Individually, you may have a whole range of different values that are there. But very often, the bringing together of collective values often involves deep and contested struggles. India's independence movement of the early 20th century was a 30, 40-year period where many of those ideas came together. We're going through a so-called second form of independence, which may be a little bit different in some senses. Fine. So there's a cauldron in which these ideas bubble up. But if you don't have the imaginations and posit them against how you can get from here to there or wherever it is, in some senses we're lost, right? And there will be multiple imaginations because the world is very complex, the world is very diverse, and effectively to deal with questions of climate, of biodiversity, et cetera, or even just food security and water security, you have to bubble it up from the bottom. Fine. You cannot drive it from the top. That's, I think, one of the core messages of a particular form of governance. Most of the world is working the other way, whether it's a corporate world or whatever it is, large political parties and other formations. So those are some of the ideas that I want to leave you with. Of course, transitions are happening. Some can be accelerated, some will be slower. They're driven by a whole range of internal processes. Managing this so-called complexity is a very important part of what we're doing. And if we're only working in some silos, we miss the systemic effects of what we're doing just now. There are deep structures that we are embedded in. We have to undo and unwork those structures. That will not happen unless you recognize where you are and what you're doing, what your core values are, and where your imaginations are going to play out and see. So I think we're going to have fun over the next 2 or 3 days. Lots of interesting opportunities, some really great people here, both online and offline. The idea here for us as an institution is to bring together certainly some of the best young scholars in the world, give them the opportunity to come out and shine and really get into deep conversation. So forget about what somebody else has taught you. You you have to speak from your mind and your heart, and then there will be contests, and the contests are actually good as long as they're respectful in some senses. So we're going to give you a good opportunity to have those conversations and take this thing forward. So thank you very much, and it's going to be, I guess we have 150 people coming in and out, so it's going to be fun. Thanks.